We'll next go to Senator Franken.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One argument that we often hear from my friends across the aisle is that we need to open more federal land to drilling and in Alaska. But if you look at the facts, it's simply not true that the big oil companies lack access to public lands, especially in Alaska. Of the more than 1 million acres of federal land under lease for oil and gas drilling in Alaska, only about 17,000 are actually being drilled by the end of fiscal year 2016. 17,000 out of 1 million. Maybe that's why the pipeline is only operating at 25% of capacity. And the Trump administration just announced that it would lease another 10 million acres of the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. They announced this in December. Simply put, there is no shortage of federal oil and gas leases in Alaska. It's not even close. And I don't know why it is necessary to open a pristine natural area like this refuge. Why the refuge? And speaking to what Senator King's questions that Mr. Sheehan could not answer, I just think that if my colleagues across the aisle think that drilling in this refuge is such a good idea, we should have hearings. We should do this as regular order, and not do this on the quick and cheap because of a tax plan. Mr. Alexander, I'd like to read you a quote from my good friend, late Senator Paul Wellstone, and get your response. Senator Wellstone fought for more than a decade to preserve the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve for the rights of the Wiccan people. Sorry if I pronounced it wrong. He said of your people, and I quote, "They are fighting for their most fundamental right to exist as an indigenous people who are an integral part of the landscape, of the unique ecology of this region. We cannot condemn the Wiccan as a people. We must respect their right for survival." You've spoken eloquently to this, and I do have some other questions, but it doesn't seem strange to all of us, to me it does anyway, that we're talking about you and by the way, thank you for your service in our military, but we're talking about changing the habitat and the way of life for these indigenous peoples to get $1 billion worth of resources, a lot of which is to address climate change. Can you just talk to the irony here? And your feelings on it?
That's absolutely correct, Senator, and thank you for your words. It is absolutely astounding that we want to, when I was in the Army, we used to call it a self-licking ice cream cone, and this is really what this has become, where we are trying to drill more oil, pump out more pollutants to address climate change and the impact that it has. And that is just insanity to me. And that's insanity to the Wiccan people. We don't understand that. And so, perhaps my colleagues here can explain it, but I can't understand it.
Mr. Lieutenant Governor, you know that the impact of climate change on your state is that your state is warming twice as fast as the rest of the country.
Yes.
And this means coastal erosion and loss of sea ice and melting permafrost. And I hear that part of the reason for drilling in this area, when there's going to be over 11 million other acres available to drill, is to address mitigation for climate change. Drilling for oil in the last pristine Arctic ecosystem on the continent, while climate change is having a disproportionate impact on the region, seems to me kind of ironic. As you've made clear, Lieutenant Governor, climate change has deeply impacted your constituents. I think we need to curb emissions and provide support to communities to help them adapt to climate change, but not by drilling in the habitat of the food source for indigenous people. Do you disagree that there's some irony here?
Lieutenant Governor, the senator's time has expired. Senator Franken.
Oh, thank you. The ranking member and the chair. Dr. Cronin, in your research, looking at caribou populations, you found that they were not significantly impacted by the presence of an oil field road. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. For this research, did you ever receive any funding from oil companies?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think receiving funding from oil companies could bias the outcomes of your research?
No, sir.
Did you ever consider that the same oil companies that funded your research would use your work as justification for drilling, and that might have been a motivation of theirs?
Well, first of all, the data we use in probably the paper you're talking about is a 2004 paper with Noel as a senior author. We use the Alaska State Department of Fish and Game data in addition to the data collected by our group. The oil industry funded studies, sometimes as a requirement for permits or for stipulations for operating after the permits were granted. And they wanted to get pre- and post-development data in some cases, or in other cases, just post-development to, in this case, look at the distribution of caribou. So whether it was used to justify future drilling, it was always done with the intent of publishing in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, which we did, and all the references that I give in my written testimony are such.
Okay, well, the manuscript says it was developed with support from ExxonMobil and BP Exploration. Is that right?
Well, depending which paper, sure.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Epstein, could you talk about why this refuge was preserved in the first place? What are the distinguishing factors that make the Arctic Refuge coastal plain different from other areas on the Arctic coastal plain? And why does that matter?
Yes, thank you, Senator Franken. One important characteristic is the coastal plain there is very narrow compared to further west where the Prudhoe Bay field is, and that means that the area that the caribou go to birth their calves is smaller. There aren't alternatives. They go there because they receive insect relief, and they also are able to avoid predators. They can see them coming, in other words. Beyond that, it is a intact ecosystem with a full range of species. It's a national treasure in a lot of ways that many refer to as America's Serengeti. I myself was there just once, not related to work. I was there recreationally, and I did see enormous numbers of caribou and really felt that I saw one of the world's great migrations happening that I felt very privileged to see. And there are a few special places like that in the world. It was quite beautiful. I included a personal photo in my testimony. Thank you.
Well, you're right that the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is home to many unique plant and animal species, including critical habitat for the polar bear, which is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and of course for the porcupine caribou that's essential, as we heard from the last panel, is essential to the Gwich'in people. Mr. Porchot, as climate change continues to affect Alaska, how important will pristine areas like the Arctic Refuge be to wildlife and to indigenous people?
Thank you, Senator. I think we heard from the other panel that climate change is very real and very dramatic the further you move north, particularly on the north slope of Alaska. And I think, again, other panelists have described climate change impacts on many things of human life and wildlife. And I think that in areas that Ms. Epstein's described for the coastal plain is, for example, a very finite calving area, the effects of climate change on that, could be substantial. And I think the answer, if there is one to your question, is really, we don't really know. And I think that's one of the issues surrounding this debate is in the absence of knowing things as science or fact or what the impacts may be, I think that argues for a cautionary approach.
Thank you, Madam Chair.